Hello, everybody, and welcome to Green Alliance's latest webinar on what the government's new climate and growth plan mean for the UK. My name is Holly Brazier-Tope, and I am Director of Politics at Green Alliance. I'm joined by a solely Green Alliance lineup today, with policy specialists across many different things I'll introduce shortly. By way of kind of brief background to why we thought it was important to put on this webinar, the UK has obviously made very impressive progress in reducing greenhouse gas emissions since passing the Climate Change Act in 2008, meeting all three of its carbon budgets so far. Those budgets have obviously set targets for total greenhouse gas emissions produced over 5-year periods, and they've been steering the UK towards a low carbon economy. We are now over halfway to achieving net zero carbon, and it's driving growth, with the green economy growing in value 3 times faster than the wider economy. As part of this, the government has obviously been facing a number of legal deadlines, by which time it needs to produce a climate action plan, laying out their plans for what they think is a credible pathway towards a lower carbon economy. Both of the previous 2 climate action plans were ruled unlawful by the courts for failing to demonstrate sufficient detail on how targets have been met. And the deadline for the most recent plan was the 29th of October 2025. And you guessed it, it came on the 29th of October. It was labelled the incredibly catchy Carbon Budget and Growth Delivery Plan, aka Climate Plan. Forgive our panellists for maybe not referring to the entire title during this webinar. And the latest plan included a number of documents. So there was a broad narrative document talking about the necessity for action on climate and nature, which went big on the kind of economic and social opportunities of the transitions in years to come. A massive document with all of the calculations for how government think they'll meet those targets, which we will delve into a bit in this webinar. An investor prospectus talking to business, and a methane action plan laying out the importance on methane emissions specifically. My job as Director of Politics is mostly to think about kind of the context in which this plan has dropped, with the breakdown in cross-party consensus and rising anti-net zero sentiment completely rife in UK politics. And it is a particularly complicated time. I will obviously do my best to kind of drip some of my vibes-based politics throughout the discussion, but this is primarily going to focus on some of the policy detail that was in the plan. And I'm thrilled to be joined by 4 Green Alliance policy experts to help me unpack what all of that means for the future of emissions and the key sectors to watch out for. So first, I will ask our Head of Climate, Nick Davis, to give us some kind of headline takeaways from the plan, as well as briefly explain some of the technical assumptions underpinning the numbers behind the plan. Second, I'll go to Johan Beckford, who's Senior Policy Advisor and will be covering transport emissions. Thirdly, our Head of Natural Environment, Lydia Collis, will talk about land use and farming. And last, but very much not least, Liam Hardy, who is our Head of Research, and will talk primarily about industry and a little bit about the Methane Action Plan. The plan for the webinar is then to open out into a wider Q&A in the latter part, so please do ask questions in the Q&A function, not in the chat. I won't be looking at the chat. And upvote other people's questions that you think are most interesting and would like us to answer. I do also have a couple of other Green Alliance lurkers in the background, in case there are things that you'd like to ask, particularly around energy, power, greenhouse gas removals and that kind of thing. So feel free to ask whatever questions you would like, and hopefully we'll be able to answer. But without further ado, I'll hand you over to our first expert, which is Nick Davis, our Head of Climate.
Thanks so much, Holly. Well, the government's new climate action plan sets out how it intends to meet the UK's upcoming climate targets, most crucially the 6th carbon budget covering 2033 to 2037. That's the first budget on a net zero trajectory. Now, the good news is that we're comfortably on track to meet carbon budgets 4 and 5, taking us up to 2032. And 3/4 of the emission savings we need for the 6th carbon budget are coming down the track through policies that have already been implemented and wider economic trends. And the government says it now has enough policies in the pipeline to close the remaining gap once wider factors are taken into account. So on the face of it, that's a step up from the previous plan, which covered only about 97% of the reductions required for the 6th carbon budget. But disappointingly, the new plan has not fully close the gap to meet the UK's pledge under the Paris Agreement to cut emissions by 68% by 2030. And the plan is also relying on some optimistic assumptions about wider social change and cascading tipping points in technological adoption. And the government has dialed down some of its deployment expectations for solutions as well, including electric vehicles, clean hydrogen production and tree planting. And some of my colleagues will discuss those things later. So how is the government getting the sums to add up? Well, the new plan quantifies two main groups of policies. There are 169 planned policies listed in the document for introduction. These will reduce emissions in the future, and those that have, and also those that have already been implemented, which are incorporated in the baseline of emissions. So the first thing to understand is the baseline. This is the level of emissions reductions already baked in to the budget period. So it includes central assumptions for population and GDP growth and future fuel prices and policies that have already been implemented. And there are also some modelling changes to reflect new evidence on emissions in different sectors. Now, the baseline is much lower than it was in the 2023 delivery plan. That's partly because some of those modelling changes, and also because some big hitting policies that were previously in development have now been implemented. Those include the zero emissions vehicle mandate to drive electric vehicle sales. That was actually the biggest carbon cutting policy in the last carbon budget delivery plan. And all of these things together lower the projected baseline emissions by around 46 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent during the sixth carbon budget period. But even when all the implemented and planned policies are added together, there's still a gap of around 166 million tonnes across the budget period. And I know those numbers sound massive, but so to put that in perspective, that's the equivalent of 1 year's emissions from all of the vehicles on the road, our electricity sector and the waste sector put together. So that's the scale of the emissions that are still missing, and that's across the whole government period, the whole carbon budget period for the sixth carbon budget. But the government says that gap is likely to be closed by the introduction of proposals that are currently at an early stage and emission savings that will be delivered by cascading effects associated with clean technology adoption and wider social change. So let's break down some of those categories. Well, the government's included 12 further early stage proposals and policies such as marine CO2 removals and salt marsh restoration, even though these are at a very nascent stage in development. The government suggests that these could save between them 43 million tonnes. That's around a quarter of the CB6 gap, the gap over that budget period. The government has also quantified the potential of cascade effects, where changes amplify or trigger changes across connected systems, helping to deliver net zero. So the kind of thing they've got in mind here is maybe you're a household, you install some solar panels, that leads you to consider getting a battery system in your home. That may then lead you to be able to make the most of lower time of use tariffs, and that helps the wider grid be balanced better. So these sort of cascading effects from taking one change. And the government has estimated that these effects could deliver 24 million tonnes of carbon dioxide savings over that carbon budget period. So that's quite a big saving being delivered by those effects, according to the government. Now, much more questionably, the plan also estimates that wider factors could deliver some big savings, and it optimistically assumes 99 million tonnes of these savings across the budget period. That's about 20 million tonnes a year. And again, to put that in perspective, that would be like taking all of our diesel trucks off the road. Now, one of these is the uptake of AI, which the government seems to assume will deliver energy and carbon savings through efficiencies. And some of those things may be possible, but it's unclear, I think, whether it's taken into account the downside impact that increased building of data centers could have, an increasing energy consumption and emissions. There's only one mention of data centers in the document, and that's related to heat capture. It would be great if the government does that, but there are apparently 100 of these in the planning process at the moment, and the biggest could consume as much electricity as 2 million households. It's also unclear whether the government plans for airport expansion have either been included in the modelling, in the baseline, or in these wider factors that it's talking about. So I think wider factors could well act as a downside drag rather than a boost. But that doesn't necessarily seem to have been factored into the government sums here, or it's a little unclear whether it has. Overall, though, I think there's a lot to welcome in this plan. The policies put Britain on course for transitioning to clean power, electric vehicles, and clean heat over the 2030s, and they'll deliver significant carbon reductions if they're implemented in full. But to add up the plan also relies on optimistic assumptions about wider cascade effects and social change. And the government has avoided taking difficult political decisions that would be necessary to accelerate emissions reductions further to meet our 2030 Paris target or ensure that the sixth carbon budget is unmissable. But I think the real test is going to be in the delivery, and the priority now must be to get on and actually deliver the climate and growth plan, supporting businesses and households to switch to cleaner technologies that we know that can deliver cost savings and end Britain's reliance on expensive and polluting fossil fuels.
Great, thanks so much, Nick. A very, very thorough kind of overview of exactly what it means overall. So now time to kind of dive into some of the policy detail. And I want to hand over to Senior Policy Advisor at Green Alliance, Johan Beckford, who's going to be talking about transport emissions.
Thanks, Holly, and thanks, Nick. That's a really helpful overview. For those of you who didn't get enough baseline chat from the first speech, unfortunately, I'm going to be coming back to it very briefly. But it's basically just to give you a bit of a sense of how things have changed between the plan of 2 years ago and the current one that was released last week. And that's because some of the biggest changes in the government's baseline emissions have come from the transport sector. So it's really worth kind of understanding what they are. Essentially, what previously was a modelled policy, namely the zero emission vehicle mandate, which Nick name checked as the biggest emissions saving policy in the plan. That has now gone from a sort of modelled policy as before and is now started to be implemented. So we're in the first year of that plan. So that has actually in part moved into the baseline. So that's why some of the figures might appear on the face of them slightly different and somewhat confusing, but actually some of the policies have moved from sort of one section of this document to another. And the same has happened with the sustainable aviation fuel mandate. So you really have to consider both the baseline and future model policies to kind of get an understanding of transport emissions across the whole. So while Nick pointed out that the baseline has effectively been adjusted down to a degree because we are further along the process of decarbonisation, if you like, the domestic transport sector actually is the only subsector where baseline emissions are projected to be higher across all three carbon budget periods than the energy and emissions projections, which kind of make up which is the modelling that makes up the baseline. So that shows you to a degree that some of the factors, the broader trends, those macroeconomic factors that Nick touched on, are actually showing that domestic transport may take a bit more time to really be driving decarbonisation than we may have thought. And that actually is not that surprising to a degree when you kind of think of the context of the domestic transport sector and transport more broadly, because it is the most significant emitter across the economy. And I think it's worth sort of dwelling on that for a second. If you include international aviation and shipping, then over 36% of the UK's emissions today are related to transport. So that is not an insignificant kind of challenge to try and overcome. We have 36 million cars on our road. We have over 5 million vans. So there's a lot of journeys out there that either we need to find an alternative zero emission technology solution for, or we need to move on to cleaner transport modes. So that's kind of some of the challenge that we're facing. So in comparison to the plan of 2 years ago, it is still, despite all of what I've said about the baseline, there are still slightly lower levels of abatement forecast here in this plan compared to that of 2 years ago. So car policies, and particularly the ZEV mandate, is still the biggest single policy saving in the carbon budget and growth delivery plan. Interestingly, though, I think in the early years, so essentially now up until 2030, the emission savings are revised down actually fairly significantly on car savings. And that's likely a sort of broader reflection of 2 years of extra sales data, which we may have previously thought would increase more quickly. But by the end of the sixth carbon budget period, so in the 2030s, those savings are now going to be higher. So whilst there is a sort of slowing at the early part of this process, actually those car policies will be delivering, according to the government, more quickly later on. And you can kind of see this backed up by some of the deployment assumptions, which are essentially the numbers which show how they've come to some of those emissions figures later on. They're in the document itself, and you can see, for example, they expect 48% of the car fleet to be electric vehicles in 2035, compared to 2 years ago where they were expecting it to be 52%. So they've slightly revised that back. When it comes to vans, those are closer to previous planned savings. They are still a little bit down, but they are fairly similar to what was seen before. And the same is with HGV savings. And I think it's really worth just mentioning HGVs for a moment, because the government has recognised in this plan that a regulation on new heavy goods vehicle sales is going to be needed. And this was actually something that Green Alliance suggested in our briefing on the carbon budget and growth delivery plan before it was released. Essentially, at the moment, we have a kind of policy vacuum when it comes to heavy goods vehicles decarbonisation, and they are a really significant polluter, despite not actually having that many vehicles on the road. So it's really good that they recognise that some sort of form of regulation needs to come down the track. And obviously, the earlier that we can consult and can prepare that new regulation, then the greater the sort of cumulative emission savings will be. So it's really important that the government tries to get that consultation out before the end of the year and kind of can learn some of the implementation sort of challenges from the car mandate. Something that is a little bit more disappointing, though, unfortunately, is the sort of, but is actually, slightly consistent across the 2023 and 2025 plans, is the lack of a kind of focus on broader modal shift and public transport solutions and active travel solutions as well in this plan. The Climate Change Committee, for example, has previously called in its sixth carbon budget advice for a 6% reduction in car demand by 2030. And there is very little in this plan that focuses on reducing the need for cars. So that's something that I would suggest is something that we continue to try and develop. There are some notable exceptions to that. So the government does include emissions abatement from increasing average occupancy rates in cars, and also references active travel spending through the cycling and walking investment strategies. But these are quite small, and they're not to any sort of great degree a primary focus in the same way as changing technologies are. So that's something I think we can still work together with the government to sort of push on. Just very quickly on aviation and shipping, then the benefit of this plan compared to 2 years ago is that there is much more detail here. So the policies are largely split out, whereas they weren't in the past. So we can kind of see where their strategy is going. They are much more specific. So you can see the kind of savings that they think will be coming down the track from sustainable aviation fuels or efficiency gains, zero emission flights and carbon pricing, for example. The strategy as a whole looks relatively consistent to previous plans. So it's very much a technology-focused rollout. As Nick mentioned, there's nothing on airport expansion explicitly and kind of curbing the excess growth in aviation demand, which I think largely many of us in the sector believe is an important part of aviation decarbonisation, particularly in the short term. But what is quite interesting is on aviation specifically, there is not a single reference to the Jet Zero strategy in this document, whereas the previous plan actually it came up quite a few times. So that may be significant that actually some of the thinking behind the scenes is sort of slowly evolving. So that's something that we can keep an eye on as well. Very briefly on shipping, there are some more details as well here, but the kind of scale of savings is slightly revised back. But that's something that we can kind of work with the government to hold them to account on those kind of proposed savings and help develop further policy. So I think before the end of the year, just by way of conclusion, before I hand back to Holly, is we are expecting that kind of big HGV regulation or a consultation on that regulation to be coming quite soon. There are going to be obviously things around the number of zero emission vehicles that are sold that come out at the end of the year is often a big sort of media moment, and we need to start to develop some of those alternative strategies, on public transport and on active travel. And the government should be releasing its integrated national transport strategy hopefully before the end of the year. So that's another moment that we can kind of pick up and try and push forward for a sort of more rounded approach to decarbonisation as well. But back to you, Holly.
Thank you very much. That was the whistle-stop tour of all things transport policy. I know that there are a lot of figures and things, so I just wanted to acknowledge for everyone watching that we plan to kind of write all of this up in a briefing and we'll send to all attendees so that you've got it in writing. There are quite a lot of questions about that, so we'll follow up after this. But for now, let the wisdom wash over you, I would say. Obviously, Johan touched very much on something that has been particularly controversial in recent years on transport policy, and the ZEV mandate and ULEZ and things like that has been very up in the political agenda, as has farming, and the role that farmers play in the UK has been talked about a lot over the last year, having had big changes under this government. So thrilled now to be able to pass on to Lydia Collis, who's head of natural environment, and he's going to talk about land use and farming.
Thanks, Holly. So agriculture and land use has been slower to decarbonise so far than other sectors of the economy. So this plan is really important for setting out the set of measures that the government sees as being necessary to reduce emissions in line with net zero. It just covers domestic emissions associated with farming and land use. So any food that's imported, because I saw a question on this, is not covered in this plan. This plan has largely the same set of measures for the agriculture and land use sector as the previous plan from 2 years ago, bar one new addition on biomethane that I don't totally understand, which is not to say that it's not understandable, it's just not my area. But that's not to say that everything that's in this, therefore, is already in policy. There are measures that are in this plan, which were also in the last one, which farmers are not yet being supported to do. So the biggest one is the use of methane suppressing feed additives, which can reduce methane emissions from livestock. That's the measure in this plan that delivers the single greatest emissions reductions from agriculture and land use, but it's not yet being supported through policy. So, but then at the same time, there are other measures where I don't want to do death by acronyms or technical language, but through farming policy in England, through schemes like the Sustainable Farming Incentive, that is supporting farmers to do some of the measures that are in this. So all of that is to say that I think from the farming perspective, it's delivery that's really, really key from this. It's good to have these measures set out in the plan, but farmers then have to be supported to do that. And that has been an issue, as I've talked about, things being in this plan, not being supported in practice. However, there are some signs from all of the pages in these documents that I've read that maybe drawing up is a bit better in this plan. And I think the bit of hope that I found on that is in the technical annex. It talks about the assumptions about uptake of the measures in this plan are the same as those that were used for the spending review. So that should mean that the farming budget that has been allocated to DEFRA was bid for on the condition that it is used to support the things that are in this plan. And that's really positive, I think, in terms of the prospect of actually delivering what's set out in this plan. So the plan has numbers that are attached to each measure to say how much they should cut emissions by. Those numbers are generally a bit less ambitious on quite a lot of the agriculture and land use measures than in the previous plan. I think there's a few reasons for that. One is slow progress so far, means that things have been slow to get going. Another is just maybe more realistic assumptions being made. But then as well, maybe a bit of reduced ambition. And there are numbers on peat restoration and woodland creation, which are a bit lower at times and a bit higher at times that they're set out for different years. So a bit of reduced ambition, I think, is a bit disappointing to see in this in some cases. In other cases, particularly specifically in terms of bioenergy crops, I'm actually pleased to see it. It seems like in this plan, the government is stepping away from supporting really massive rollout of bioenergy crops, which was present in the last one. There's a bit of language in the technical annex that makes me a bit confused, because maybe it says that it's still going to happen, it's just going to be privately funded rather than government funded. So if anyone's dug into the bioenergy crop side of things, I'd be keen to know what you think this whole plan means for it. The last thing that I'll say is that the numbers do all add up through this section because of the quantification of what are called early stage policies, which Nick talked about at the beginning. And I think it's fine to have some things that aren't that well developed, which we expect to be cutting emissions in the 6th carbon budget, because it's a little way off, but they will rapidly need developing. And it's things like, it's a really wide-ranging set of measures in this sector, actually, from salt marsh creation to seaweed production to some sort of undefined agricultural things. So the key will be to see those rapidly move out of that early stage category and into actually being delivered. So yeah, I guess my main summary is that the plan doesn't set actual policy for this sector. That needs to come through good join up with DEFRA and with farming policy in England and in the devolved nations, and that's where the key will be for this sector. So I'll hand back to Holly. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lydia. I mean, we are basically barreling from one core political area to another. So finally, I just want to pass to our head of research, Liam Hardy, who's going to talk about industry. And obviously industry and industrial decline in the UK is one of the things that is really driving the politics of the day. So what does the plan say about it? Liam?
Yeah, thank you, Holly, and thanks to the other speakers as well. I'll just talk through some of the reflections on the plan. I won't go into loads of detail, but hopefully it's useful. I mean, just again, reiterating a sort of similar message that compared to the previous plan from 2023, the sort of savings from listed policies is lower. I think, again, that's because some policies have moved into the baseline, and the baseline, the ambition of the baseline has sort of absorbed some of the ambition from the last plan. But also, I wonder how much of this might be through to simply, as you mentioned, Holly, the closure of some industries that's been taking place over the last year or two that may have been shifting that baseline. And then again, there'll be some impacts from those cascade effects and those early stage policies that Nick talked about. I mean, just one example of where it isn't just a matter of moving the numbers around on the spreadsheet, but the predictions for the volume of carbon capture and storage deployment or hydrogen production are both considerably down compared to that 2023 plan. Again, maybe not surprising because time has passed and progress has been slow, and actually other technologies have sort of come forward to displace some of that ambition, especially on hydrogen. But I think that's quite interesting. The biggest saving in the industry sector in the plan is now from what the government describe as fuel switching, which actually is a bucket for both electrification, but also the use of hydrogen or the use of biomass in replacing essentially fossil fuels in industrial processes. The projected savings from fuel switching are the only thing to have increased from 2023 to last week's plan. And there's a clear shift within there towards electrification, doing the bulk of that work, those emission savings, which is right and good to see that reflected. But it's very much still not clear how the government's going to sort of make that happen. They've talked about in the industrial strategy and again in the plan last week that there'll be some support from what they're calling the British Industrial Competitiveness Scheme, which should come in from 2027. And they've also got the British Industry Supercharger, which discounts some network costs for businesses. But those interventions are sort of small and definitely not sufficient to tackle the scale of the problem of high electricity prices, particularly in industry. And also the government continues to confirm that the Industrial Energy Transformation Fund, which was a sort of a fund to help companies with the upfront costs of introducing some decarbonisation measures, that's closed and won't reopen. And so that means there's no mechanism for CapEx investment support from the government at the moment. As I say, we're awaiting news on more solid policy to help cut electricity costs. So we're hoping that the government might be able to bring forward a business model for electrification in the same way there are business models for hydrogen and for carbon capture and storage. And this is really the biggest emission at this stage. And it's a really crucial challenge for the government, especially the Treasury, to resolve. Just a little note on what's in that sort of early stage policy bucket for industry. The main policy there that's kind of essentially they're pretty confident they'll do, but they don't know exactly how much it will save, I suppose, is something around boosting the demand for low carbon industrial products. And this is going to be very important for many of the different subsectors within industry, but I can't say where that's going to end up. The consultation on that just closed recently, and so that's still a big unknown. So essentially on industry, there's still a lot to come. We're expecting a new industrial decarbonisation plan. We're expecting a steel strategy. We're expecting a circular economy strategy. The climate plan from last week also mentions a decarbonisation strategy for off-road machinery. And of course, related but not quite the same is the government's big and yet to be decided plans around the North Sea and the transition in the North Sea. So essentially, not a lot has changed. Some changes for the good and some changes in ambition, but ultimately we're still waiting on a lot of the clarity and the direction on industrial decarbonisation. Just a little note on methane before I finish. As Holly mentioned, we're very pleased to see the publication of the government's methane action plan last week. It's something we've been calling for a long time. The plan rightly recognises the really crucial importance of urgent action on methane emissions, which can be the emergency brake on global warming. There's a couple of new promises in there. There's something around resolving a financing issue for capturing landfill methane. And there's a promise to look at international fossil fuel import standards to cut methane emissions from supply chains around the world. But generally, very little has changed from sort of previous government's intentions on methane. So I think it's a little bit of a missed opportunity to bring forward new interventions which could improve not just our methane emissions and therefore our warming impact, but also things that improve health, cut air pollution, and bring in more circular economy practices as well. So more work to do on methane as well. That's it for me. Thanks. Back to you, Holly.
Sorry, technical difficulty. Thank you very much. Really, really helpful. So just to flag to everyone, we are now going to move into a kind of Q&A, and I'm going to kick it off and ask a few questions from me. There are quite a lot already popping up in the Q&A box, but please do both add your own questions and upvote ones that you would particularly like us to focus on. Just quickly, I mean, I've got a couple. So I think one of the things to mention is that none of the stuff that came out in the plan is actually new. It's not new policy. There is very little in there that we didn't already know. It's broadly from, lots of people think it's just a narrative document that's pulling things very helpfully together all in one place. Is that true? And what does that mean for, how much can we think into cross-departmental buy-in to this plan, and how much, it's not just a DESNZ publication? I wonder if I can come to maybe both Lydia and Johan on this. Lydia, you first.
Yeah, thanks, Holly. So I think in there not being loads of surprising stuff, I think that is a sign that lots of the policies that we need to cut emissions up to the end of the sixth carbon budget, which is what this covers, are already in progress or are known about. There's certainly some in agriculture and land use that are not yet implemented, and that's where that cross-departmental piece is so important, because it's all very well this being a DESNZ own document. If DEFRA aren't going to then pick it up and put it in place, then we're not going to see progress against it. So I think so much of what we need to see is in the good implementation of what's in this plan. It's a really long document. All of the technical annexes alongside it are really long, and it is quite dry, and that's kind of the point. It is meant to be this document that brings together all of those policies to say this is what it all adds up to, and that's so important. It's something that we don't have on nature, for example. We have a target to halt nature's decline by 2030, but there's nowhere that does this kind of like, we're doing X and that will do this, and we're doing Y and that will do that, and that adds up to delivering that target. So it's so important to have this document that puts that all together in the same place, but at the same time, it's not the document that's going to mean it all happens. There's so much more that is then needed.
Yeah, just to build off Lydia, I think that's right. To a degree, we might all be guilty of suddenly thinking this plan is coming and therefore we're going to see a whole range of new policies that we can really get our teeth stuck into. But that's not necessarily the whole purpose of the document. And actually understanding the kind of assumptions, or trying to interpret what the kind of assumptions are behind already existing in policy, is actually really critical. So you can kind of see some of the impacts of that in certain areas. So in my area in transport, you can see that the slightly lower levels of emissions abatement in the short term kind of is quite useful in one sense to understand how the government sees this policy developing. I mean, that kind of reflects how technologies maybe haven't grown as quickly, or the sales of electric vehicles, for example, hasn't necessarily grown as quickly as we may initially have hoped, although they are still growing and complying with the zero emission vehicle mandate, which is really encouraging. So the position for us as part of the sector, we can then engage with that and look at the ways in which implementation can improve and how we can support the uptake of some of these technologies. I think also now we can see the government is kind of still changing some of its broader approach. So you can see that it has, unfortunately, in the last couple of years, made some changes to some of these high-profile policies, the ZEV mandate being the really obvious example. There's been kind of flip-flopping from consecutive governments on elements of it changing, which is unhelpful. But now we have had the introduction of the electric car grant, for example, which is a good shift, I think, that we would really welcome, that shift from sort of tinkering with regulation, which undermines investment, to actually supporting demand side solutions to help the policy that is already in place to work as effectively as it can. The other thing I would say about this plan, though, that is interesting is there are additional policies that we can still as a sector more broadly and in our dialogue with government help shape, because there are policies that are not yet in place but are potentially going to have an impact later on in the carbon budgets process. So an example of that is that there is a policy listed in this document that highlights like further reduction of emission savings from the road vehicle stock, which is sort of helpfully vague, I think, in the sense that we can see that there will potentially be the need for something to happen in the 2030s, but we don't know exactly what that's going to be. So there's an opportunity for the government to work with the sector, to work with industry, to kind of shape what that can be so that we can accelerate emission savings later on. So there are still opportunities for us to kind of see how things evolve over the whole period from now till 2037.
Excellent, really helpful. There are some really good questions in the chat, some of which are quite spicy, which I'm really looking forward to. But I'll just ask one more question of our panelists. That I think, on, following on from the fact that there isn't really new policy, it's collating old policy. How do we feel about the approach that has actually been taken to now? So particularly, obviously, DESNZ have worked really hard on this plan specifically, focusing on, I absolutely hate this phrase, but carrots and not sticks, aka kind of choosing not to go for bans and instead looking at incentivizing take-up of different things. Do we think that that's the right approach? And so, Nick, can I maybe bring you in on kind of the heat and buildings and boiler aspect? And Liam, I mean, also on the methane side, I feel like they're the two areas we've maybe covered slightly less. Nick, you first.
Thanks, Holly. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And I think in some cases, carrots are the right approach, certainly politically. But actually, it's really interesting having this document setting out all the quantification and the savings delivered from all these policies, because you see that actually, when you look at the emission savings, it's often the regulatory measures that deliver the really big savings. But I think it probably needs to be a combination of both, as Johan was alluding to there when he was talking about electric cars. You need demand side support for consumers and businesses and households to sort of kickstart the transition and take up of these technologies. But then you ultimately need that sort of regulatory backstop. And I think heat and buildings here is a good example. We know that switching from gas boilers to super efficient electric low carbon heating is going to be essential to cut 2/3 of the emissions from buildings and reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. But in this plan, Ed Miliband has astutely avoided negative headlines and further backlash against the green agenda by ruling out the 2035 gas boiler sales ban that Boris Johnson's government had actually previously floated. And I think in the circumstances with the political headwinds they're facing, I think that taking that carrot approach to retrofitting home heat pumps is probably the right approach to maintain support for the transition now. But there are certainly other regulatory or certainly other examples where it's really essential that we do carry on moving forward with regulatory measures. So, I mean, if you look at this plan, you'll see that big changes to building regulations in the past to tighten up energy efficiency standards are actually leading to pretty massive savings in the Carbon Budget 6 period. We've got the Future Home Standard coming in soon. That's going to make it default for new buildings, new homes to have to have heat pumps and solar PV, and that's really essential. And the government's also introducing higher minimum energy efficiency standards for the private rented sector. All of those three things are really going to deliver quite big change. Interestingly, the government still has a regulatory measure in place on clean heat. That's the clean heat market mechanism, and that works in the same way as the zero emission vehicle mandate. It puts a mandate on manufacturers to sell a rising proportion. And what is quite notable actually in the plan is that the emission savings for that policy have been slightly downgraded, and I don't know what that says about where the government sees the direction of travel here in terms of tightening up that regulation. But they are still counting on the switch from heat pumps to from gas boilers to heat pumps being the default choice for households from the mid 2030s. That's a big challenge. So we are going to have that mix of carrots and sticks to get there. But I think it's a right choice at the moment for the government to have avoided that sort of political trap of saying that they would go down that route of banning the sale of gas boilers.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I won't speak much more on this, but I agree with you that you need a mixture of both. I think carrots and sticks, and I think that the carbon budget process is sort of naturally built such that the most effective policies are the ones that lay out exactly what we need to do and when, rather than kind of hoping on so many unknowns. Just I suppose that in the context of methane, there's a couple of thoughts on this from both sides. One is, well, the main thought is that there aren't that many carrots or sticks coming from the government on methane in some of the areas that we'd like to see them. So, for example, in the energy sector, in the upstream oil and gas sector, where there's thousands of tons of methane leaked or vented or flared every year, a huge waste of essentially fossil gas, which could otherwise be used, brought on shore and sold on the market. The government is moving forward on venting and flaring, or the industry is moving forward on venting and flaring, but still with a fairly long and slow timeline to 2030, when they say they'll stop routinely venting and flaring methane. But the government has not brought forward any new regulation to prevent leaks and to encourage oil and gas operators to do frequent leak detection and repair, which is something we've been asking for some time. So that would be a stick that they aren't using, and I think it makes sense to use a stick there for businesses and companies that are generating these emissions. They're well placed to do more in that regard. On the other side, in terms of agriculture and methane emissions from our food system, which Lydia touched on, the one thing that hasn't been discussed at all in any of this, and I notice a question in the Q&A on this as well, is the role of diets and diet change. And clearly, I understand very clearly why. It's a difficult political topic to discuss, but I think it is incumbent on the government to start a conversation with the public about the impact of our diets, what that means in terms of changes we might want to make, which would benefit our health and our natural environment and our emissions impact. And those conversations don't have to be difficult and don't have to be telling people what to eat. They can, actually people want to have those conversations. People are interested in hearing from the government about how the government can help them to make healthy and sustainable choices around their diet. So that's a carrot that's, forgive the pun, a carrot that's very much missing from the conversation. And again, it doesn't have to be a big deal. We just have to start that conversation at some point.
Really helpful, thank you, Liam. And you've addressed one of the questions in the chat. So I'm going to turn to the chat because there are a few really good questions, and I'm going to take the first two together that have been upvoted the most. So obviously the Climate Change Committee, CCC, lay out recommendations for what government should do to enable decarbonisation in the UK. There is a question about how far the policies announced in this plan align with those recommendations and whether there are any sectors that, where the plan diverges significantly. I think the second question also links to that as to whether, we feel that this plan does enough to do the job to avoid legal implications. Does it follow enough of those recommendations and advice in order to do so? I would also welcome kind of the political context around the latter. And obviously people have referred to the political headwinds we're facing, and the scrutiny of the Climate Change Act in particular need to play into the thoughts around the second one. But can anyone come in on the Climate Change Committee and where things diverge? Who'd like to take it? Either Nick or Lydia, please.
I can come in with one where actually the government's going further than the Climate Change Committee at the moment, and that's on their assumptions about heat pumps. We've just been talking about that when the government is actually counting on 10 million tons of CO2 savings a year from from making heat pumps the default choice when people are switching from their gas boilers by the mid-2030s. And they're actually assuming in this plan that there'll be 9 million installed by 2035. That's about 31% of the housing stock in the UK at the moment. And that's actually going beyond the latest advice from the CCC, which was published in their Carbon Budget 7 advice earlier on in the year, where they set an expectation for there to be around 26% by 2035 if we were going to be on course to meet our targets under the 7th Carbon Budget. But as I was just alluding to, that is a challenge without that regulatory backstop. So gas boilers have a 15-year life cycle. So ultimately, we need to make them the default choice by 2035 if we're wanting to hit net zero by 2050. Government's got some policies in place. It's got the clean heat market mechanism, which I mentioned already. It's faced some backlash on that, and I think it's going to take quite a cautious approach. But that does give us a mechanism for increasing the sales of heat pumps over time, and it's also at the moment consulting, or has consulted on, extending its boiler upgrade scheme. And in the spending review, it set out that it was going to carry on. It's going to increase spending on that over the rest of the Parliament to incentivise the uptake of heat pumps. But I think it is actually going to be very challenging to meet either the assumptions in the government's plan or in the CCC, in fact, because there are still some very big challenges. There's big upfront costs, which remain a barrier for many households, and that's what the government's trying to address with the boiler upgrade scheme. There's also a skill supply issue that they need to get to grips with. We need, at the moment, there's around 11,000 engineers who are qualified to install heat pumps, but we need at least 120,000 to get up to those numbers by the mid-2030s, or maybe more. And probably most crucially, it's the high cost of electricity relative to gas. So that is probably the one change that could drive the uptake without those regulatory measures, which is making at the moment the price of gas is 4 times that of electricity. The price of electricity is 4 times that of gas, and heat pumps are much more efficient in how they produce heat using electricity, but they're only 3 times more efficient than gas boilers. So if you can reduce the disparity between electricity and gas prices, you could provide a really strong incentive for the government to meet those targets. But that's one area where the government's actually going further in its assumptions than the CCC.
Great, thanks so much. Obviously the CCC will be looking at these numbers, I'm sure, very closely, and we've got I think some people from the Climate Change Committee watching, so I'm sure we'll hear from them in due course. Just to move it on, there are quite a lot of questions from a number of different people taking different approaches, but looking fundamentally at the same thing on kind of engineered removals, greenhouse gas removals, and how much they are relied upon in this plan. So I think people are referring to it in both transport, particularly on aviation, but also in terms of a number of other areas. So I wonder if I can just come particularly to Lydia and Johan on where we think that sits and whether that is right.
Yeah, so on engineered removals, ambition has come down a bit compared to the plan of the previous government in terms of the emissions that will be removed by engineered approaches in the 5th and 6th carbon budgets. I think there's, from what I looked at on this, they collate the different approaches that you might take to engineered removals into one line, and I wasn't able to find a breakdown of exactly what's contributing that. I have major concerns about power BECCS, so that's bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, where you're growing bioenergy crops and then burning them, capturing the CO2 and regrowing the crop, and that's supposed to constitute a removal. And there is quite a bit in this, picking up from the Alan Whitehead review, about questioning the sustainability, or the potential for that to actually work. So I think they have reduced the ambition on that a bit, but like I say, because it's all amalgamated together, it's slightly tricky to pull apart. At the same time, I think technology is going to develop, and there are a wide range of approaches to engineered removals that are captured in this, and hopefully some of them are going to work. Is it ambitious? Yes, definitely. And it's going to be expensive. So, but the reason that you need it is because of emissions elsewhere in the economy, and particularly when you start looking towards the seventh carbon budget, it's more difficult to bring emissions down without quite a bit of removal, because it would rely on changes that are impacting people's lives in terms of what they're eating and how they're traveling and that sort of thing. Yeah.
Very briefly, jump in on aviation. What I would say is that aviation is an incredibly hard to abate sector, and all of the kind of projections that we have from the CCC, from the government, across both Carbon Budget 6 and the Carbon Budget 7 advice, have a pretty significant wedge of aviation emissions still being around in 2050, because we don't currently have a sort of scalable technological solution for zero emission aviation in the way that we have a sort of scalable solution for road vehicles. So I don't have loads of detail on the kind of relative proportions of those between this and Carbon Budget 6, but happy to look at it further. But I think it is a fair sort of thing to keep a very close eye on for us as the broader environmental sector, to hold government and the CCC's feet to the fire, if you like, on the amount that we have to rely on greenhouse gas removals. And the much simpler solution from an aviation perspective is to reduce the total emissions that we're emitting at the moment. And the only sort of direct way we have to do that is to reduce the growth in demand here. And I think actually, if you dig into some of the Climate Change Committee's figures, although they've taken a less direct approach on sort of airport expansion and the amount of flying that we should do, if you actually look at the total air traffic movements that kind of underpin some of their recent advice, it shows that it's quite a bit lower than I think the government is potentially thinking. So not expanding airports is, pretty basic climate solution. And actually, it's something that we would urge the government to reconsider some of its proposals on things like Gatwick and Heathrow, particularly because they will have significant emissions implications. I know NEF have done some work on this and various others as well. But it also is unlikely to potentially have some of the wider sort of economic impacts that I think the government is hoping for. So it's in order to make us rely less on greenhouse gas removals in the future, then emitting fewer, having fewer planes circling as we do at the moment is a helpful strategy in that.
Excellent. As we only have 2 minutes left, I'm going to ask each of our panelists one question, which I want a one sentence, and I mean one sentence answer. Is this plan good enough? Liam.
Oh, I was hoping you wouldn't come to me first, Holly. Look, my personal view is it's not good enough, but that doesn't mean it's not a good start, and that we need to crack on and get on with it. It could. It's a hard thing, and I'm not at all envious of the government, but there are some gaps, definitely.
Nick?
Thanks, Holly. I think this plan shows the enormous progress that's already been made from policies that we've got in train, and the huge progress we're going to make. But it is, of course, a massive challenge meeting net zero. And I think probably the government are doing just about the best they can at the moment, considering the political situation that they're in and the opposition they're facing. And I think maintaining support for the Climate Change Act at the moment probably trumps going further on some policy areas.
Lydia?
I think it's all in the delivery for me. I think the plan's fine. Like, could it be better? Yes. Are there some issues with it? Yes, probably. But if we delivered everything that was in this, it would get us quite a long way. So maybe let's go on with doing that.
Love it. Johan?
Yeah, it's by no means perfect. There needs to be more on public transport, on active travel, more on on aviation that includes demand reduction. But yeah, it is ultimately about delivery at this stage. We can't sort of necessarily hang around and keep discussing it in theory. We need to make sure that these policies do deliver. So we should all put our shoulder to the wheel to make sure that we can do that as quickly as possible.
Excellent. Thank you so much to my wonderful panel and for all of you for participating and asking such great questions. We will follow up as promised with a recording of this webinar if you'd like to share it, or if you'd like to come back and check anything. We will also share a summary of some of our key line takeaways with some of the stats so that you can better access them and share them around. But for now, thank you so much for joining us, and see us on the next Green Alliance webinar. Thank you.